The air over the Hollywood Hills was unusually still that night, as if the city itself had paused mid-breath. From the narrow curves of Benedict Canyon, the lights of Los Angeles stretched endlessly, a scattered constellation on the earth below. At 10,050 Cielo Drive, a warm glow bled from the windows into the darkness. Soft, domestic, almost sleepy. Inside, Sharon Tate moved through the rooms with the slow grace of late pregnancy, the weight of her unborn child a constant presence. She was 26 years old, on the cusp of motherhood, her life and career balanced in a strange, hopeful limbo. The house, with its white stucco walls and dark wooden beams, seemed to hold the echo of every conversation, every whispered plan. That night, the air was scented faintly with the garden's jasmine, the sweetness drifting in through an open window. Somewhere beyond, in the blackness of the canyon, the sound of a lone dog barking carried like an unanswered question. It was the 8th of August, 1969, a Friday that began without incident. Sharon's husband, director Roman Polanski, was in London on business. In his absence, she filled her days with visits from friends, short walks in the garden, and the occasional phone call to her mother in Italy. Those close to her would later recall that her voice had seemed light, but edged with something they couldn't name. Perhaps it was the heat Los Angeles had been gripped by a summer both sweltering and restless. Or perhaps it was the faint unease that comes when shadows seem to linger a little too long in the corners of a room. At the far end of the living room, a wall-length mirror reflected her image back at her. A young woman in a flowing dress, hair like a halo under the lamplight. Mirrors have a way of catching more than they should, holding versions of ourselves that feel almost separate, almost prophetic. Sharon adjusted a cushion on the couch, glanced at the clock, and noted how the hours were slipping toward midnight. Outside, the canyon was darker than usual. The moon, shrouded by thin cloud, gave little light. Somewhere far off, the hum of a car engine climbed the hillside. It wasn't unusual Cielo Drive wound past other homes, but in the oppressive quiet of that night, every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate. Sharon Tate was a figure caught between worlds that evening. To the public, she was the shimmering actress of Valley of the Dolls, the blonde beauty who seemed born of sunlight and champagne. To those who knew her intimately, she was gentle, sometimes shy, and happiest in moments far from Hollywood's glare. And then there was the private self, the one only she carried, a mix of anticipation for her child, a longing for her absent husband, and if her friends' memories are to be trusted, a thin thread of apprehension she never quite voiced. In the city below, neon lights flickered, clubs throbbed with music, and the counterculture beat of 1,969 pressed on. But up in Benedict Canyon, time moved differently. It was the kind of night where the stillness felt almost staged, as though the world were waiting for its cue. The hands of the clock edged closer to midnight, and somewhere beyond the soft boundary of light spilling from the house, in the layers of shadow where the road bent out of sight, movement began. In the years leading up to that August night, Sharon Tate's life seemed like a carefully composed montage, golden images strung together, each more glamorous than the last. Born in Dallas, Texas, she was a military child, her early years defined by constant movement. From Texas to Washington State, then overseas to Italy, she grew into her beauty in the way a photograph slowly develops, almost imperceptibly, until one day the world takes notice. Italy was where her presence began to carry the weight of inevitability. She was the kind of young woman who turned heads without trying, whose laughter was soft but somehow magnetic. In Rome, she moved through piazzas and cobblestone streets with the same unstudied elegance that would later define her on screen. The camera didn't just love her, it lingered. Her entrance into acting was not so much a calculated career move as it was a slow surrender to opportunity. She began with small parts, uncredited flashes of beauty in the background, until her role in Eye of the Devil introduced her as something more than ornamental. Her beauty was undeniable, but what caught those who worked with her was the way she could hold a moment, stretch it, make a look or a pause feel like a story in itself. Meeting Roman Polanski was the turning point. He was sharp, European, and brimming with a kind of creative volatility that both fascinated and unsettled her. Their relationship was a swirl of parties and projects, of intense connection and periods of distance. Hollywood saw them as a golden couple, the brilliant, mercurial director and the luminous young actress. But beneath the magazine covers and film premieres, there were cracks. Friends noticed Sharon's occasional loneliness, the way her gaze sometimes drifted in a crowded room. Hollywood in the late 1962 was a strange ecosystem, a place where friendships were forged in champagne but dissolved in gossip, where beauty could be a shield and a prison. Sharon navigated it with a grace that seemed almost fragile, as though she understood the currents could turn without warning. By 1969, she had begun to imagine a life less defined by the industry's demands. She and Roman had rented the Cielo Drive house from music producer Terry Melcher. It was secluded, yet social, a place where friends could drop by without the intrusion of paparazzi. The French country-style home had a charm that felt out of place in the California hills: slanted ceilings, thick beams, a fireplace that gave the rooms a kind of hushed intimacy at night. But there was something about the house, too, that carried a subtle tension. Neighbors whispered about the strange energy of the property, about the revolving cast of guests from the music and film world, some of whom brought their own shadows. The summer of 1969 was heavy with a kind of unarticulated dread. Across Los Angeles, a sense of cultural unraveling was in the air. The optimism of the mid-decade had curdled. The headlines were full of political assassinations, war protests, and sudden senseless violence. The hills seemed quieter at night, as though the city's undercurrents had seeped into the canyons. In the midst of it, Sharon was 7 months pregnant, her belly rounding beneath loose dresses, her hair growing longer, softer. She spent afternoons arranging the nursery, selecting fabrics and colors with a gentleness that suggested she was building a cocoon against the outside world. Friends described her as serene, though in quieter moments, she admitted to feeling uneasy in the house when alone. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would stand at the large front windows and look down toward the glittering city lights. They felt distant, almost unreal, like another world entirely, one that could not touch her here. And yet, something about the darkness between the hills always seemed to hold its breath. The image of her life at that point was perfect on the surface. A promising career, a celebrated marriage, the imminent arrival of her first child. But perfect images are dangerous. They can shatter without sound, leaving behind only shards, each reflecting a different version of the truth. The house on Cielo Drive seemed to exist on its own axis, perched high above the city, yet somehow removed from its pulse. Its pale exterior caught the afternoon sun in a way that made it almost glow, and in the cool of evening, it turned into a quiet silhouette against the darkened hills. To visitors, it felt like a hideaway. Winding roads led to the long driveway, where the gate stood half-screened by climbing vines. Inside, thick wooden beams framed the ceilings, and the scent of old timber lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the perfume of flowers from the garden. The property had a history, though not one that was openly spoken of at dinner parties. Before Sharon and Roman, the house had been rented by Terry Melcher, a music producer known for his connection to the Byrds and his social orbit of musicians, actors, and hangers-on. He was also a man who had unknowingly brushed against danger. Among those who had once tried to charm their way into his world was a man named Charles Manson, a fringe figure from Los Angeles' counterculture, whose ambitions in music never matched his talent. Melcher had declined to work with him. By the time Sharon moved in, The connection was faint, just one more ghost in the long list of people who had passed through the property. The driveway, the heavy front door, the path through the garden. They all belonged to Sharon now, or so it seemed. But houses have a way of keeping their own memory, absorbing the energy of what came before. Sometimes it's nothing more than an impression, a feeling that hangs in certain corners, a shadow that doesn't quite belong to the light. The house's isolation was part of its allure. At night, the street outside was nearly silent, the occasional sweep of headlights cutting briefly across the front windows before disappearing back into darkness. Neighbors were not close enough to hear voices or see details, only to catch fragments, if anything at all. Sharon loved to entertain there. Friends came for long dinners, for wine in the living room, for afternoons spent drifting between the garden and the pool. The sound of laughter against the stillness of the hills created a strange, beautiful contrast. But in the quieter hours, the isolation could feel vast. When Roman was away, Sharon sometimes called friends late, just to fill the space with conversation. There were small, curious details, things most people would overlook. A door latch that sometimes slipped loose overnight. The faint smell of cigarette smoke near the gate, though no one in the house smoked. Once, a neighbor swore they saw figures on the edge of the property in the early morning hours, but when they looked again, the driveway was empty. Sharon brushed these things aside. It was the hills, after all. The wilderness pressed in close here. Stray noises, shadows, and the occasional trespasser were part of the geography. Still, the house on Cielo Drive seemed to be listening. Even in daylight, there was a sense of it watching from its windows, its rooms holding more than just furniture and photographs. At night, when the lights from the city below looked like distant embers, the house seemed to sink deeper into its own silence, an almost expectant quiet, like the moment before the start of a scene. For Sharon, the house was meant to be a refuge. But as summer moved forward and the air grew heavier with heat, it began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a stage one where the walls were waiting, and the audience had not yet revealed itself. By July of 1969, the heat over Los Angeles had thickened into something almost tangible, a weight in the air that pressed down on the canyons, holding their scents and sounds in place. The days were long, the sun relentless, and even after dusk, the air carried a strange metallic warmth. People stayed out late, drifting between house parties and nightclubs, the streets glowing with neon and the low rumble of motorcycles passing through. But beneath the surface of that summer, the city was changing. News of the Zodiac killer filtered down from the Bay Area. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam had broken the nation's trust further. The assassinations of the previous year Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. still reverberated in conversation, always close to the edge of fear. It was a summer that felt swollen with the sense that something was ending, though no one could say exactly what. Up in Benedict Canyon, the heat pooled in the hollows of the hills. The nights were quieter here, but the silence was not comforting. It was the kind that seemed to listen. Sounds carried oddly. The clink of a glass on a patio table, the bark of a dog far away, the sudden snap of a twig from somewhere unseen. Sharon, now in the late stages of her pregnancy, spent most days indoors, moving slowly from room to room in loose gowns that trailed around her ankles. The heat made her restless. The stillness of the house, more so. Friends came often. Jay Sebring, the stylish hairdresser who still harbored a gentle devotion to her. Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress with a poet's sensitivity. Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail's boyfriend, a Polish actor and writer. They brought with them conversation, the clatter of dishes, music from the record player. But when the guests left and the front gate latched again, the quiet returned with a heaviness that was hard to shake. There were moments when Sharon would stand in the nursery, her hand resting on the curve of her belly, looking at the crib they had chosen, a pale wood, soft to the touch. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and the lavender sachets she'd tucked into the drawers. In the afternoons, the sun fell through the small window in a narrow, sharp beam. making the dust motes visible, turning the air itself into something you could almost touch. Roman called from London, his voice crackling faintly on the line. They spoke about the baby, about the garden, about the heat. Sharon didn't tell him about the odd feeling she sometimes had at night, the sense that the dark outside the windows was heavier than it should be. She had always been sensitive to atmospheres, but now, alone in the hills with the city lights far below, it felt sharper, like a note held too long in a piece of music. There were rumors, too, circulating through Hollywood parties, whispered between friends. Stories about strange people moving through the canyon at night, about a group in the desert with unsettling ideas, led by a man whose name was said more in curiosity than in fear. Charles Manson was not yet a household name, but in certain corners, he was a rumor that wouldn't quite fade. The summer was slipping toward its close. The edges of August were approaching, and the air felt as though it were waiting for something. In the evenings, the sunset turned the hills a deep, bruised purple before giving way to the blackness of night. The house on Cielo Drive stood there, pale against the dark, its windows glowing faintly, like watchful eyes. If Sharon noticed how the heat carried the sound of footsteps differently, or how the shadows near the tree line sometimes seemed to shift, she said nothing. In a city like Los Angeles, strangeness could be explained away, but there are summers when the air itself remembers. And in 1969, the heat was remembering something none of them could yet name. They appeared like background figures in a photograph out of focus, half noticed. The kind of people who seemed to belong nowhere in particular. In the late 1962nd, Hollywood was crowded with wanderers. Some drifted in from the desert, others from cities they'd left behind. They hung around coffee shops, sat on curbs outside recording studios, loitered at the fringes of the Sunset Strip. Charles Manson's followers moved in this way. Not quite invisible, but difficult to fix in the mind. Mostly young women, often barefoot, with hair that tangled in the wind, and men whose eyes carried a strange, unblinking calm. They spoke of freedom, of a world unbound by rules, but their words had the weightless quality of rehearsed phrases. They were rarely still, for long walking in loose knots, hitchhiking, appearing at house parties without anyone remembering who had brought them. The Hollywood hills were not immune to these wanderers. The twisting roads and secluded homes made it easy for someone to pass unnoticed. Mailboxes sat at the ends of driveways, gates were often left open, and in the shaded spaces where the asphalt broke into gravel, it was possible to stand for several minutes without being seen from the windows above. Cielo Drive had its share of curious visitors even before Sharon lived there. The house's former tenant, Terry Melcher, had once met Manson in connection with a possible recording project. It never materialized, and Melcher moved on, but Manson, by some accounts, didn't. Whether he knew Melcher had left or not, his people still remembered the house. Sharon was likely unaware of the depth of these connections. To her, the strangers who sometimes appeared in the neighborhood were part of the city's background noise. She had been in Los Angeles long enough to know that the line between eccentric and dangerous was often invisible until crossed. There were sightings unconfirmed, and in hindsight more unsettling. A young woman seen near the gate at dusk, pretending to pick flowers. A man walking slowly along the road, pausing at the driveway as though reading something in the air. Once, a friend of Sharon's arriving for dinner thought she saw a figure slip into the trees as her car turned in. They laughed it off at the time. Country spooks, someone called them. The truth was, the hills could hide almost anything. Behind the glamour of Beverly Hills' manicured streets lay pockets of wildness, dry creek beds, tangled eucalyptus groves, abandoned trails where the dust rose in little clouds under your shoes. From these hidden places, a person could watch the glittering houses above without ever being seen. Sharon's world was still full of warmth friends, late dinners, the comfort of familiar voices, but small shadows had begun to collect at the edges. They were not yet shapes, not yet threats, just a feeling, as if the air in certain rooms had thickened, as if the walls sometimes listened a moment longer before letting the sound fade. In the distance, in places she would never visit, there were gatherings. Manson speaking in a low, hypnotic tone, spinning visions of chaos to come. His followers listening with the rapt attention of people who had already given up their former selves. In those circles, talk sometimes drifted toward Hollywood, toward houses high in the hills, toward people whose names could open doors. And somewhere between the city and the desert, the idea of Cielo Drive lingered like an unclaimed photograph, a place remembered, a place not yet finished with. The first week of August arrived with a pale haze over the hills, a heat that clung even in the early hours. Sharon moved slowly, now her pregnancy was in its final stretch, each step carrying the weight of expectation. Friends who visited spoke of her radiance, how she seemed to glow in the filtered light of the living room. But some also noticed the shadows under her eyes, the way her gaze would drift toward the windows as though listening for something. In those days, her circle closed tighter. Jay Sebring visited often, his presence easy and reassuring. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski stayed for stretches at a time, the house filling with the rhythm of shared meals, small talk, and music from the record player. Roman's absence was felt, but Sharon seemed determined to keep the space warm and occupied. The nursery was ready, the pale wood crib waiting by the window, soft blankets folded on the chair beside it. In the evenings, she sometimes lingered there, rocking slowly as the last light faded from the canyon. Yet, there were moments when the warmth of companionship could not quite push back a subtle disquiet. On one evening, as she stood at the kitchen counter, she noticed the faint scent of cigarette smoke drifting through the open back door. No one in the house smoked. Another time, Jay found the front gate standing wide in the early morning, the latch unfastened. He closed it without comment. The days were slow, but not idle. Abigail spent hours reading on the patio, her voice occasionally breaking the silence when she read a passage aloud. Frykowski moved between the pool and the shaded porch, sketching and making calls. Sharon took short walks in the garden, her sandals pressing into the warm earth. The jasmine blooms overhead, releasing their sweet scent into the heat. Friends later recalled that she spoke more than once about wanting the baby to arrive soon, as though the anticipation had begun to weigh on her. But there was also a strange undercurrent, a flicker of restlessness, almost impatience, that did not match her usual calm. She was, by nature, attuned to atmosphere, and the atmosphere that summer seemed to hum with a note just out of reach. Outside the gates of Cielo Drive, the city was busy with its own currents. Music was spilling from clubs on the Strip. Film productions were moving into the fall season, and in the shadows of both worlds, smaller, more dangerous dramas were taking shape. Far from the canyons, in a ramshackle commune in the desert, the family was deepening its hold on Manson's vision of an impending apocalypse. In his words, the rich and the famous were both symbols and targets. It is impossible to know if Sharon sensed the threads tightening. Perhaps the unease she felt was no more than the weight of the summer, the isolation of the hills, the absence of her husband. But those who saw her in those final days remembered that she sometimes paused mid-conversation, her expression distant, as though she were listening to a sound no one else could hear. The house was still a place of comfort, with its thick walls and wide windows framing the hills. Yet by night, it could feel like an island. The road below disappeared into darkness, and beyond the edge of the pool lights, the garden was swallowed by shadow. On the final evenings of her life, Sharon would walk through these spaces barefoot, her hands resting on the life within her, her eyes drawn to the windows. The clock was moving toward a night that would not pass quietly. And in the deepening heat of August, the sense that someone was drawing closer became almost impossible to ignore. The 8th of August, 1969 began without ceremony. The morning sun spilled over the canyon in muted gold, catching the leaves in the garden, brightening the stucco walls of 10,050 Cielo Drive. Inside, the air was still cool, heavy with the scent of coffee and cut flowers. Sharon moved through the room slowly, the rhythm of her steps softened by the thick rugs. She was 8.5 months pregnant, her body carrying the weight of 2 lives. Throughout the day, visitors came and went. Abigail Folger, always poised, drifted between the kitchen and the patio, a book in hand. Wojciech Frykowski stretched out near the pool, soaking in the heat, occasionally wandering inside for a drink. Jay Sebring arrived in the late afternoon, his easy charm filling the spaces between conversations. It was a day of small, ordinary moments, laughter over lunch, the clink of glasses, the hum of a fan turning lazily in the corner. The hours slipped by, the light shifting toward evening. From the windows, the sky beyond the hills began to blush with the colors of dusk. The record player spun quietly in the background, the low notes of a melody weaving through the air. Sharon wore a flowing white dress, her hair loose over her shoulders. She looked like a figure half-stepped out of a dream, luminous and unhurried. By nightfall, the city below had begun to glow, thousands of small lights flickering like embers in the dark. The group settled into the living room, conversations breaking into quiet laughter. Outside, the night deepened, the air turning warmer, almost close. The moon hung behind a thin veil of cloud, giving the canyon a dim, silvery cast. At the far end of the driveway, the gate stood closed, its latch faintly rusted from the summer air. Beyond it, the road curved away into darkness. For most of the evening, that darkness was just a backdrop, the quiet beyond the property as steady as it had always been. Then, sometime before midnight, there was the distant hum of an engine, a car climbing the canyon, its headlights cutting briefly across the brush before vanishing again. Inside, no one seemed to notice cars came and went along Benedict Canyon Road at all hours. But the sound grew closer, the engine slowing as it approached the turn for Cielo Drive. In the garden, the jasmine stirred faintly, as though brushed by a passing current. The house itself seemed to pause, the laughter inside tapering into softer voices. A clock on the wall ticked in slow, even beats. The car stopped just beyond the gate. 4 figures emerged into the night, their faces pale in the low light, their movements purposeful. They carried with them the strange, focused quiet of people who had already decided what they would do. Up at the house, the windows glowed warmly, unaware. Inside, the evening moved forward in small steps, another drink poured, another story told, a gentle hand resting on the curve of Sharon's belly. The air in the canyon held still, as if listening, and somewhere in that stillness, the space between ordinary life and the unthinkable had already begun to close. The first light of morning did not bring peace to Cielo Drive. It revealed the sun crept slowly over the ridge, spilling its pale gold into the canyon. The house stood quiet in that early light, its windows still, the air heavy with the scent of eucalyptus, and something else, something metallic, faint, but impossible to ignore. At first glance, from the road, it might have looked like any other sleepy hillside home. But the gate was open, hanging slightly off-center, as though disturbed in haste. It was a young caretaker who first stepped onto the driveway that morning, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes. He carried with him the ordinary thoughts of his daily routine, expecting to find the house as it always was, still, serene, waiting to be tended. Instead, the stillness felt wrong. The air seemed thicker. And then, as he moved further in, the wrongness became impossible to dismiss. There were shapes in the garden where no shapes should be. The glint of something unnatural in the morning sun metal, darkened, lying half hidden in the grass, and there, against the perfect white of the stucco, a stain the color of rust, running in slow, uneven lines. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. Not the peace of an empty home, but the hush of something that had been stopped. The living room was as it had been hours before, glasses still on the table. A chair turned slightly toward the fireplace. Yet the air felt crowded, as if the room held on to the violence that had passed through it. In the brightening light, details began to resolve. Outside, on the lawn, lay the body of Jay Sebring, his dark hair matted, his face turned toward the gate. Beyond him, Wojciech Frykowski sprawled near the porch, his clothes torn, the morning wind lifting a strand of hair across his face. Abigail Folger lay further down the slope, her white dress marked in cruel patterns. And inside, Sharon. She was found in the living room, her long white gown stained, her hair loose around her face. She had fallen onto her side, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The child she carried 2 weeks from birth was still. The sight was almost unbearable in its stillness. The serene image of her, so like the photographs in magazines, shattered by the reality before them. News traveled quickly. By midday, the house was surrounded uniformed officers, detectives, photographers, holding their cameras like weapons of a different kind. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that made the scene appear almost staged, like the set of a film stripped of its actors. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering, their faces drawn with the uneasy thrill of proximity to tragedy. The crime scene became a kind of theater. Men in suits bent over notepads, marking the positions of bodies with numbered placards. Technicians moved with measured care, photographing footprints, bagging objects. The press waited at the edge, their lenses reaching as far as they could. Words like ritual and slaughter began to take root, whispered from one reporter to another. Inside the house, the mirrors reflected the morning light with a cold indifference. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily on, as though nothing had happened at all. By afternoon, the bodies were taken away, leaving the house strangely empty, its silence deeper now. But the stain of the morning lingered in the grass, in the walls, in the minds of everyone who stepped through that door. The city below, alive with its usual noise, had not yet absorbed what had happened. But the hills knew, and from that day on, Cielo Drive would never again be just an address. The first days after the murders were a blur of shock and rumor. Los Angeles, a city accustomed to scandal, had no frame for this 4 lives cut down in a secluded home. The brutality so extreme it seemed almost theatrical. The press swarmed with questions. Who would kill a pregnant actress and her friends? Why here? Why like this? Detectives moved quickly but without direction. At first, there was no clear suspect, no single thread to pull. The crime scene, though meticulously documented, told a story without context, multiple entry points, signs of struggle, the crude scrawling of a single word in blood across a door, pig. It was an image that burned itself into the city's mind, a grotesque signature without a name. The victims' connections were combed over in detail. Sharon's marriage to Roman Polanski, his European film career, their friends in Hollywood's upper circles, all were examined for signs of hidden enemies. Jay Sebring's clients were wealthy and influential. Abigail Folger came from one of America's richest families. Wojciech Frykowski's past was colorful, his acquaintances eclectic. Every name they had touched became a possible lead. In living rooms and cafes across Los Angeles, theories multiplied. Some whispered about drug debts, others about occult rituals. The brutality was too pointed, too strange to be the work of mere burglars. The summer heat seemed to magnify the paranoia. Every shadow in the hills began to feel heavier. It was in this atmosphere that an old name resurfaced: Charles Manson. To most, it meant nothing. To a few, it was a reminder of strange encounters of a man who hovered at the edges of Hollywood, trying to edge his way into the music business. Terry Melcher had known him, briefly, and had once invited him to Cielo Drive. The connection seemed flimsy, but it was enough to catch an investigator's interest. In truth, the The trail to Manson and his followers was winding and indirect. Another set of murders, at a house in Los Feliz the following night, bore similarities too specific to ignore multiple victims. Random brutality, messages in blood. When police linked the handwriting, the pattern began to take shape. The arrests, when they came in December, were anticlimactic. Unwashed, barefoot young people pulled from a desert commune, their eyes shining with something between devotion and detachment. The motive they offered was as surreal as it was chilling. Manson's vision of an impending race war he called Helter Skelter, a fantasy stitched together from fragments of the Beatles' music, biblical prophecy, and his own fevered ambition. The murders at Cielo Drive, they said, were meant to spark chaos, to make the world believe they were the work of black revolutionaries. And in the chaos, Manson's family would rise. For those who had known Sharon, there was no comfort in the explanations. The randomness of it was almost worse than a personal vendetta. Her death had nothing to do with her life. She had not been targeted for who she was, but for where she was, an accident of a dress. And yet, the narrative that took hold in the papers was less about the randomness and more about the symbol. Sharon became an emblem of innocence destroyed, her image radiant, expectant, set against the stark horror of her end. The press, hungry for a name to hang the fear on, found it in Manson. The city found a villain, but the truth was more complicated, tangled in the way chance and human cruelty sometimes intersect. In the weeks after, when the police tape came down and the house stood empty, neighbors swore the air on that street still felt different. There are some violences that alter the landscape, marking it invisibly, so that even long after, you know when you've stepped inside their shadow. In the years that followed, Sharon Tate's name drifted between the worlds of memory and myth. To those who loved her, she remained a living presence, her voice, her gestures, the way she moved through a room still vivid in the mind. To the public, she became a frozen image, the luminous actress in the white gown, the expectant mother whose life had been stolen in a night of senseless violence. Roman Polanski returned to Los Angeles, to a city forever changed. He walked through the house on Cielo Drive after the police released it, each step an encounter with absence. The nursery was still intact. The crib beside the window, the folded blankets, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the air. The stillness there was unbearable. He would later describe feeling as though the walls themselves remembered. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers became a national spectacle. In the courtroom, the family sat smiling, sometimes laughing, as testimonies recounted the details of that August night. Manson's eyes followed every witness, his gaze steady and unnerving. The verdicts guilty on all counts brought a measure of justice in the legal sense, but they could not close the wound left in the cultural imagination. Sharon's mother, Doris Tate, became an unlikely advocate. In the years after her daughter's death, she fought tirelessly for victims' rights, speaking at parole hearings, ensuring the killers remained behind bars. In doing so, she reclaimed a part of Sharon's story from the headlines, anchoring it not only in tragedy but in resilience. Yet the fascination with Sharon's death never faded. Books, films, and endless retellings revisited the events, often blurring the line between honoring her and exploiting her. The house on Cielo Drive changed hands, but its reputation clung stubbornly. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was simply a reminder, visible and immovable, of the night Los Angeles lost its last illusions about safety. Eventually, the house was torn down, replaced by something new, as if erasing the structure could erase the memory. Still, the story remained. Sharon's life, her laughter in Italian cafes, her quiet grace on film sets, her tenderness in preparing for her child, was reduced too often to its brutal ending. But those who truly knew her spoke of other images. Her love for animals, the way she could silence a room not with beauty but with a sudden, thoughtful question. The warmth that made strangers feel like old friends. Decades later, Her face still surfaces in unexpected places. A photograph on a magazine cover, a still from a film, a candlelit vigil on the anniversary of her death. There is always the same look in her eyes, a light that belongs to someone in motion, someone in the middle of her own story. It is that unfinished quality that lingers. The night of the 8th of August closed one chapter with a brutality that still echoes, but it did not erase what came before. In the quiet of certain Los Angeles nights, when the heat hangs low and the hills fall silent, it is possible to imagine her still there walking barefoot through the garden, her dress brushing against the jasmine, her gaze lifted toward the city lights below. Sharon Tate's legacy is not only the horror of her death, but the stubborn, enduring presence of her life. And like the canyon itself, it holds both beauty and shadow, forever intertwined, forever waiting at the edge of memory.